16th November 1944. Rain had been falling since midnight, turning the foxholes of the 94th Infantry Division into shallow bowls of cold brown water that swallowed boots and numbed legs within minutes. Private Daniel Harker, just 20 years old, skinny, pale-eyed, and too quiet for most people to even remember, sat with his back against a slick tree trunk on the southern edge of the Saar Forest. Artillery rumbled somewhere in the fog, distant enough to ignore but close enough to vibrate in his ribs. He kept wiping his glasses with the hem of his soaked M41 jacket, but the lenses fogged again instantly. That morning, he had overheard two sergeants muttering that the Germans held the high ground with interlocking MG42 nests, and anyone trying to cross the clearing ahead would be shredded in seconds. Their platoon had already lost 3 men the previous night when they tried to push forward. No one volunteered to try again. Daniel wasn't supposed to be the one who changed everything. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't even considered particularly brave. But he saw things other men overlooked. He watched patterns, studied silences, counted seconds between bursts of German fire. His father had been a hunter back in Idaho, and Daniel had spent his childhood hours lying in the grass, waiting for deer to reveal themselves by the faintest shift of a shadow. That instinct, finding movement where others saw only stillness, would decide the fate of his entire platoon. At 06:10 hours, the fog thinned just enough for the men to see the outline of the clearing ahead, a 200-yard stretch of churned mud, broken branches, and abandoned German ration tins glinting faintly. Beyond it, the enemy positions vanished into dense pine. No visible muzzle flashes, no silhouettes, just waiting guns, invisible and deadly. Lieutenant Caldwell crouched beside Daniel and asked him quietly if he noticed anything strange. Daniel nodded, but didn't answer yet. He'd been watching for 15 minutes, noting that the fog swirled differently on one patch of the tree line, slightly delayed, as if something just behind it displaced the airflow. The lieutenant didn't see it. No one else did. They saw an empty forest. Daniel saw a hidden corridor that the Germans were using to shift machine gun crews between nests. He tapped the lieutenant's sleeve and whispered, "They're not reacting to noise. They're reacting to silhouettes." Caldwell frowned. Daniel explained. 3 attempts had been made to cross the clearing, and each time German fire erupted within exactly 2 seconds of a man going upright. No matter how quiet they were, the shape triggered the guns. That meant the Germans were disciplined, waiting for a target profile. Daniel's voice shook when he said the next part. "I can bait them, but not how you think." The lieutenant froze. Daniel's idea wasn't insanity. It was reckless brilliance. Daniel had studied the clearing at dawn and noticed a fallen tree with a long, straight trunk. If he dragged it upright with his body behind it, he could create a soldier-shaped silhouette without exposing himself fully. The Germans would fire at the silhouette, revealing every hidden muzzle as tracers tore through the wood. Once the nests were exposed, the rest of the platoon could hit them with rifle grenades, Bayar bursts, and mortars. The lieutenant refused at first, but minutes later, after another wounded man was dragged back from a failed probe, he returned to Daniel, eyes hollow. "You're sure you can do this?" Daniel nodded once. Caldwell clasped his shoulder, then told everyone to prepare fire on his signal. At 06:43 hours, Daniel crawled into the clearing through the mud that clung like wet cement. The men held their breath as he reached the fallen trunk, thick, heavy, still half-rooted in the ground. He pressed his cheek into the freezing mud as he looped a canvas strap around the trunk. His fingers trembled as he pulled the strap over his shoulder. He knew that once he lifted it, he would be the most hunted thing in that forest. He counted to 3 silently and pulled. The weight surged upward like lifting a corpse, slow and resistant. The trunk rose enough to resemble a standing man. Daniel crouched behind it, using his whole body to steady it. For 3 heartbeats, nothing happened. Then the forest erupted. MG42s hammered the trunk with a shriek of metal fury, splintering wood into a fountain of exploding bark. The silhouette trapped every round, shielding Daniel except for the shockwaves pounding his lungs. But he wasn't just hiding. He was watching. The moment the first gun opened, he spotted the faint muzzle glow between two pines. Tracers from another weapon came from a low ridge to the left. A third machine gun lit up on a small rise he had completely missed earlier. He shouted coordinates behind him, voice cracking from the concussion. Rifle grenades whooshed over his head, bursting exactly where he had estimated. The left nest went silent instantly. The ridge nest fired again, but now Daniel shifted the trunk just enough to force them to adjust their angles. Their correction exposed them to a bar team on the right flank, who opened fire until the gunner slumped forward, lifeless. Daniel moved slowly, tugging the trunk with him, forcing the Germans to keep firing at the shifting shape. More muzzle flashes, 2, then 3, revealed themselves further back in the trees. A mortar crew behind Daniel began launching rounds that fell closer and closer until 2 nests vanished in bursts of smoke and splintered timber. But the Germans started to realize something was wrong. The silhouette wasn't falling, it wasn't bleeding, it wasn't screaming. One officer must have sensed the trap, because suddenly the MG-42 fire ceased. The forest fell into an eerie hush, punctuated only by the buzzing echo of the earlier barrage. Daniel knew he had seconds, maybe less, before they tried to flank or retreat. Then he saw movement. A squad of German grenadiers, 12 of them, creeping toward the right flank to hit the American lines. Daniel couldn't shout. They were too close. Instead, he released the trunk and sprinted sideways, mud flying off him, lungs burning. He made himself visible for half a second. The Germans spotted him and instinctively fired. That muzzle burst was enough. The lieutenant ordered immediate suppressive fire, and the entire American line thundered to life. Half the grenadiers fell instantly. The rest dove for cover, but were caught in overlapping bar fire that cut them down before they could regroup. Daniel dropped on his belly, gasping, glasses cracked but still clinging to his face. The clearing was now shrouded in smoke and drifting fog. The Americans surged forward to secure the captured nests. They found bodies, dozens, strewn around shattered MG emplacements, many still clutching ammunition belts. They counted at least 38 confirmed enemy dead from the exposed nests alone, with more likely unaccounted for deeper in the pines. Daniel didn't speak. He just sat with his hands on his knees, shivering violently, trying to understand why he was still alive. Men walked past him, patting his shoulder, some murmuring thanks, some simply staring at him with a new respect or disbelief. By 0900 hours, the platoon pushed into the forest, now knowing exactly where the enemy's lines had been. They advanced faster than anyone expected. Daniel followed behind them, rifle in hand, but his mind replayed every second of his stunt. The shockwaves, the splinters, the grinding weight of the trunk pulling at his shoulder as German bullets tore it apart. It felt like someone else's memory, not his. But the day was far from over, and the Germans were far from finished. Daniel's human bait trick had broken the first line, but the deeper forest hid even more danger. Danger that would challenge him again, test everything he learned that morning, and claim the lives of men he had just fought beside. And at some point in the chaos that followed, the total number of Germans killed because of his actions would rise far beyond 38, reaching 52. That part of the story had not yet begun. The forest swallowed sound as the platoon advanced, moving in a staggered line through dense pines that dripped from the morning's rain. Daniel kept close to Sergeant Kirby, who had stopped teasing him for being the quiet Idaho kid ever since the clearing. Now, Kirby walked with a strange protectiveness, glancing back every few minutes as though making sure Daniel hadn't disappeared. The fog clung low, turning the trees into columns of shifting grey, and the smell of damp earth mixed with the acrid scent of burnt powder carried over from the shattered German nests behind them. By midday, the forest had changed character. The ground sloped upward into a series of ridges, each one offering perfect defensive positions, and Lieutenant Caldwell knew the Germans wouldn't abandon those advantages. The platoon slowed, stepping carefully around fallen branches and shallow pits that might be hiding booby traps or tripwires. Daniel felt the shifting air on his face the same way he felt tension in a room. He could sense when something ahead was wrong. He wiped his cracked glasses again, smearing mud across his sleeve, and froze when he noticed an odd depression in the ground about 10 yards ahead. It wasn't the shape that bothered him. It was the rhythm of the leaves. They fluttered, but not from the wind. Someone beneath them had just shifted. Daniel whispered to Kirby, who motioned for the lieutenant. Caldwell swore softly when he saw it. The depression was a hidden German listening post, a foxhole covered with pine branches. The lieutenant signaled the men to fan out, but before anyone moved, a faint metallic click cut through the silence. A grenade spoon. The ground erupted as a German soldier burst from the foxhole, shouting as he hurled a stick grenade. Daniel and Kirby dove as it detonated with a hollow crack that shook the forest. 2 Americans were thrown against trees, and a third slumped forward, motionless. Daniel scrambled to his knee and fired 3 quick rounds into the German as he tried to reload. The body dropped instantly. The platoon dragged the wounded back while Daniel knelt beside the foxhole. Inside were field phones, wire coils, and half-burned message sheets. Proof the enemy was coordinating deeper positions. Caldwell looked over Daniel's shoulder. They were waiting. We're walking into teeth. They pushed on. By 1400 hours, the forest narrowed into a natural funnel between 2 rocky rises. This was the kind of terrain that made men feel small, like insects in a canyon. Daniel could hear the Germans shifting again, so subtle that it felt like catching the faintest tremor in the air. The platoon's point man raised a fist and everyone froze. Then machine gun fire ripped down from the right ridge. The first burst killed the point man where he stood, cutting him down before anyone even saw the gun. The Americans scattered, taking cover behind trees that weren't nearly thick enough to be real protection. The gunner was skilled, sweeping the base of the ridge with terrifying precision. Caldwell shouted for suppressive fire, but no one could see the nest. Daniel pressed his back to a trunk, breath heavy, dirt stinging his eyes as bullets chewed through the bark inches from his face. If they stayed pinned, the Germans would flank from the left ridge. If they tried to retreat, they would be chased down from above. The lieutenant crawled to Daniel's side and asked if he could locate the nest. Daniel didn't answer. He was counting again. The bursts came every 8 seconds, same length, same arc. That meant the gunner was fixed in place, but the bullets weren't coming straight down. They curved slightly. Daniel studied the angle, watching how the splinters flew. Then he dropped flat and pressed his cheek to the cold ground. From that angle, he saw it. A faint shimmer in the rocks halfway up the ridge, a slit where fog drifted differently. He tapped Kirby's boot and pointed. Kirby squinted, but saw nothing. Daniel told him to trust him. They needed a diversion, something to make the gunner reveal his exact muzzle. A simple silhouette wouldn't work this time. The Germans had already caught on to that trick. But Daniel realized something. The gunner wasn't shooting at shapes anymore. He was firing to pin them, not kill them. That meant he was working with partial visibility and assumed the Americans were still clustered near the funnel's entrance. Daniel crawled forward through the mud on his stomach, moving inches at a time. Kirby hissed at him to stop. Daniel kept going. He reached a fallen sapling, branches stripped clean, and snapped one off quietly. It was long enough to stick out from behind a rock. He raised his helmet on the branch and slowly angled it upward, making it look like a man trying to peek. The gunner took the bait instantly. A burst erupted from the slit in the rocks, exposing a flash of fire and smoke. That was all the lieutenant needed. Caldwell shouted coordinates, and a rifle grenade arced up and slammed into the opening, followed by 2 bar teams hammering the ridge. The machine gun sputtered, then fell silent. The platoon surged up the slope cautiously. Inside the nest, they found 2 Germans dead and 1 barely breathing. Blood soaked the rocks. Daniel stood in the entrance, staring at the bodies. He wasn't numb yet. Shock still fluttered in his chest, but something inside him was shifting. The men didn't see a 20-year-old kid anymore. They saw someone who somehow understood the forest, the angles, the traps. They pressed deeper. Around 1600 hours, the fog thickened again, turning daylight into a dim, bluish haze. The men were exhausted, boots heavy with mud, faces streaked with grime. Then they found something unexpected. A small clearing with a crude German encampment. Just a fire pit, bedrolls and a pot of half-cooked barley. The camp was abandoned only minutes earlier. Steam still rose from the pot. Daniel crouched, studying the ground. Footprints pointed east, but not away. They circled back into the trees like someone looping to attack a trail from behind. He stood up fast and shouted for everyone to take cover. They reacted, just in time. A German squad opened fire from behind the logs surrounding the clearing, bullets slicing through the air. One American fell with a cry. 2 others hit the ground and rolled for cover. Daniel dropped beside Caldwell and fired into the trees, watching for movement. He spotted a muzzle flash to the left and squeezed off a shot. The flash vanished. But this squad was different. They weren't just attacking. They were herding the Americans, trying to force them into a tightening arc of overlapping fire. Daniel saw the pattern instantly. The Germans weren't trying to overwhelm them. They wanted to push them into a kill pocket. He told Caldwell, who ordered the men to stay low and not fall back, no matter how instinctive it felt. The German squad advanced again, but Daniel had been waiting for their shift. The moment the enemy moved from cover, he fired at the lead man. The soldier dropped and chaos erupted. Kirby and the bar team opened fire, hitting 2 more. The Germans tried to reposition, but Daniel kept predicting their angles, calling out bursts of movement even before they appeared. The firefight lasted 7 long minutes. When it ended, 13 Germans lay scattered around the clearing. The Americans lost 2 men and had 3 wounded, but they held the ground. The death count was rising. From the morning's nests, the Grenadier Squad, the Ridge Gun Team, and now this ambush. Daniel didn't know yet that his tally would soon reach 52. The rest of the platoon did. They whispered it among themselves when he walked past, not with awe, but with a kind of gratitude. He was the reason many of them were still alive. Night began creeping in early as winter shadows crawled across the ground. They moved into deeper, darker forest, where the trees closed in overhead. Every sound felt amplified, the snap of twigs, the crunch of boots, the distant rumble of artillery. Daniel felt the weight of the day settling on his ribs, but something else gnawed at him too. He knew the Germans weren't finished. He felt it in the air. That quiet tension before something snaps. At 1900 hours, they reached the base of a wide ravine with steep walls that forced them into single-file movement. Daniel instantly hated it. The terrain felt wrong, too narrow, too exposed. He whispered to the lieutenant that the ravine might be a choke point, and Caldwell nodded, but they had no alternative route. If they didn't cross before nightfall, they would be trapped in the open forest. Halfway through, it began. A flare burst overhead, bathing the ravine in whitish-blue light. German rifles opened from above on both sides. The Americans dove for cover, but there was almost none. Panic rippled through the line. Men flattened themselves against the ravine walls, trapped under the murderous crossfire. Daniel pressed himself into the mud, ears ringing, heart pounding. Tracers ricocheted off rocks inches from his skull. Kirby yelled something, but it was drowned out by the gunfire. The lieutenant crawled toward Daniel. "Tell me you see something. Anything." Daniel didn't see. Not at first. He heard it. A faint clicking above the gunfire. Metal on metal. A belt feeder on one of the MGs, being reloaded. Reloading meant one gun was down temporarily. Daniel scanned frantically until he spotted a shadow shifting against the flare-lit wall. He pointed. "Left side, 20 yards up." Kirby didn't hesitate. He fired a long bar burst into the shadow. A scream echoed down the ravine, but they were still trapped. The Germans were tightening the angle, corralling them again. Daniel's mind raced. The ravine walls were jagged, broken stones, jutting roots. If someone could climb just a bit, no, not someone, him. He was the smallest, the fastest, the least likely to be noticed. He turned to Caldwell and shouted that he could get above the Germans. The lieutenant refused, grabbing his collar, but Daniel pulled away. "If we stay here, we die." Caldwell closed his eyes, then nodded once. Daniel shoved his rifle across his back and began scrambling up the ravine wall. His fingers dug into roots, boots slipping on wet stone. Bullets hissed past him, slicing bark and dirt. Twice he nearly lost his grip, but he climbed higher, pressing himself into shadows until the gun crews came into view. 2 MG teams, close together, focused entirely on the men below. Daniel crawled behind them quietly, pulling his M1 free. He took a breath so deep it hurt his ribs. Then he rose to a knee and fired, 2 shots into the gunner of the first nest. Then pivoted and fired again at the second. The loaders spun, shocked, reaching for him, but Daniel kept firing, his rifle bucking violently as he took them down one by one. The firing from above stopped. The ravine fell silent, except for the ringing in everyone's ears. Daniel stood above the dead Germans, chest heaving, mud streaked across his face, his glasses cracked, but hanging on. Kirby's voice rose from below. "Holy hell! He did it!" The platoon regrouped, climbed the ravine slopes, and secured the nests. 14 Germans lay dead around the 2 MGs. Added to the day's count, Caldwell estimated the total enemy dead connected to Daniel's actions was nearing 50. But the night wasn't done with him. Not even close. Across the ridge ahead, deeper in enemy territory, the Germans were regrouping, setting one last trap, one final stand that would decide how many Americans survived the night. And that was where Daniel's human bait trick would be used again. But in a way no one could have predicted. Night pressed over the Saar Forest like a tightening fist, the cold sinking into every layer of damp cloth the men wore. The platoon had lost count of how many hours they had been fighting. Time no longer moved in minutes but in bursts of gunfire, in the shallow breaths between danger and death. They were deep in enemy territory now, far beyond the line they were supposed to reach by sundown. The forest felt denser, darker, older, as though the trees themselves had watched centuries of war and now stood witness to another. Daniel walked a few paces behind Lieutenant Caldwell, who now checked on him every few minutes in a way that was half habit, half disbelief. Men were whispering about him again, but it wasn't the awe from earlier. It was quieter, heavier. Daniel wasn't just a soldier anymore. He had become the strange force guiding them through a forest designed to kill them. He didn't act like he noticed, but inside, the weight pressed down harder than his soaked gear. Around 2100 hours, the platoon halted near a rocky outcrop, overlooking a wide depression in the terrain. Fog pooled in it like a blanket of milk, thick enough to obscure anything beyond 10 yards. The lieutenant gathered the NCOs and tried to gauge their next move, but there was only one real choice: cross the depression or risk getting pinned down in the open if the Germans attacked before dawn. Daniel stood apart from the group, listening. The forest had a sound at night, a chorus of dripping branches, wind brushing needles, distant thunder. But beneath that, he heard something unnatural, a faint metallic clatter, irregular. Not movement, not loading, adjusting. Machine gun tripods, several. He whispered to the lieutenant that the Germans were ahead in the fog, not at random positions, but arranged in a half-moon arc around the depression. Ambushers, waiting for any American silhouette to step into the basin. Caldwell's jaw tightened. He had suspected a trap, but not one this large. He asked Daniel how many guns there were. Daniel said he couldn't tell exactly, but it sounded like at least 4, maybe 5. The lieutenant muttered a curse. If they entered that bowl, even cautiously, they would be wiped out before they could find cover. The men waited, cold and silent, as Caldwell paced, trying to think. Then he stopped and turned toward Daniel, and his expression told the platoon everything. He didn't even have to say the words. Daniel felt the air leave his lungs, his heart hammered, not from fear of dying, but from the realization that his trick, the human bait silhouette, had become their only reliable weapon in this forest. The enemy trusted their machine guns more than their eyes, meaning they could still be manipulated. But this time, it wouldn't be a tree trunk. The fog was too thick. The silhouette would have to move, shift, lean, enough to draw sustained fire so the Americans could map every gun position by sound alone. Daniel nodded before the lieutenant asked. The decision had already formed in his mind. He wasn't being brave. He simply understood the situation as clearly as he understood the shifting winds back home on his father's ranch. Some jobs fell to the man who saw the pattern first. The men tried to stop him. Kirby grabbed his arm. Another soldier swore at him for even considering it. But Daniel simply stepped away, adjusting the cracked glasses on his face like he always did when thinking. He told them quietly that if they didn't find the nests, they would all die anyway. His voice didn't shake. That was what frightened them most. He moved down the slope toward the fog. Every step sank into wet earth. Every breath felt like inhaling cold wool. When he reached the basin's edge, he crouched low and pulled a white bandage from his pocket, a strip of cloth from the medic. He tied it around the barrel of his rifle, letting the loose end dangle. In the fog, it would sway like a sleeve, a human arm, a moving silhouette. He gripped the rifle by the sling, extended it sideways just enough for the cloth to flutter. Then he took a step forward. The enemy reacted instantly. A burst tore through the fog from the left, lighting the mist gold for an instant. Daniel dropped and marked the sound. 50 meters. Elevated. Slightly angled. He shouted the coordinates back. Caldwell relayed them. A team prepped rifle grenades. Daniel shifted the rifle again. Just a nudge. Another burst erupted from the right side, farther back. Harsher tone, faster cycle. A second MG-42. Daniel ducked, rolled, and took another step forward into the murk. The fog swallowed him completely now. To the men above, he was gone. Inside the basin, Daniel could hear his heartbeat in his ears. He lifted the rifle silhouette higher, the cloth fluttering like a reaching hand. A third gun fired from somewhere nearly behind him. He spun and dropped to his belly as the rounds whipped overhead. His cheek hit cold mud, but he had the angle. 3 guns exposed. Caldwell shouted coordinates. Grenades fired. Explosions thumped the earth. But the enemy was not done. A flare shot up from somewhere within the fog, bathing the basin in harsh, snowy light. Daniel's shadow stretched across the fog like a ghost. The Germans saw the movement, and every gun in the arc opened fire at once. The air filled with the shriek and hiss of bullets slicing the mist. Daniel sprinted sideways, bent low, using the flare's dying glare to track muzzle bursts. He counted 1, 2, 3, then found the 4th gun by the way the fog vibrated with its overlapping rhythm. The 5th gun revealed itself by mistake when its loader became impatient and shouted something in German. Daniel raised his rifle just enough to show the cloth silhouette again. 5 guns hammered at it. Splinters of stone exploded near his boots as bullets ripped the mud. He felt one round punch the air beside his ear, so close it stung like a burn, but the positions were mapped now, all of them. He shouted. Caldwell signaled. The forest erupted behind him as the Americans unleashed coordinated fire. Rifle grenades arching overhead. BAR bursts sweeping the arcs. Riflemen firing into precise angles Daniel had marked. Explosions rocked the tree line. Screams echoed. One machine gun fell silent. Then another. Daniel crawled through the fog until he reached a stump. He crouched behind it, panting, the first real fear clawing up his spine. He didn't hear the 4th gun anymore. Then the 5th went silent. Only 1 gun remained, firing erratically now, desperate. Daniel steadied his shaking hands, lifted his rifle silhouette one last time. The final gunner reacted, and Daniel sprinted toward the muzzle flash. He reached the nest as the loader fumbled with a new belt. The gunner swung the MG-42 toward him, but Daniel leaped into the pit, driving the butt of his rifle forward. The gunner toppled back. They grappled, rolling in the dirt. The German tried reaching for a pistol, but Daniel slammed his elbow into the man's wrist, grabbed the pistol, and fired once. Silence fell over the fog. Daniel climbed out of the pit, chest heaving, breath visible in shaking plumes. The flare's faint glow died above him, plunging the basin back into darkness. The Americans rushed down the slope, shouting his name, their boots pounding the earth. Kirby reached him first and grabbed his shoulders so hard the impact nearly knocked him over. The lieutenant stared at him like he wasn't sure Daniel was real. Men crowded around, muddy, exhausted, alive only because he had walked into the fog alone. They counted the bodies in the shattered nests. 14 more Germans. Adding the morning's kills, the grenadier squad, the ridge gunners, the ambush team, and the 5 machine gun nests in the fog, the total reached 52. 52 Germans killed as a direct result of Daniel's actions, 52 deaths that saved dozens of his own brothers in arms. But Daniel didn't celebrate. He sat on a rock at the basin's edge, wiping mud from his glasses with trembling fingers. He didn't speak for a long time. The men settled around him, quiet. The forest wind hissed through the pines like distant whispers. After a while, Daniel finally said, "I just didn't want any more of us dying." Kirby put a hand on his back. No one said a word. As dawn neared, the platoon moved through the forest that had tried to swallow them. Smoke drifted from shattered nests. Pine needles carpeted the ground where firefights had carved open the night. Daniel walked with the others. Not ahead anymore, not hunted anymore. Just walking, breathing, alive. Before they reached friendly lines, the lieutenant called a halt. He turned, looked at the 20-year-old who had changed the day's fate, and told him quietly that what he did would be written into the battalion record. Daniel only nodded. He didn't do it for records. He did it because he knew, better than anyone, that sometimes survival depends on understanding shadows, angles, silhouettes, and the courage to walk into them. And that was how a quiet, unnoticed kid from Idaho, just 20 years old, used a simple human bait trick to kill 52 Germans and save his entire platoon from annihilation in the Saar Forest.